Good evening, everyone. Is this microphone on? Good evening? Whoa. I can go and sit there. The connection really tonight is Cole, in that Dawn was one of the three curators of the most recent Manifesta, Manifesta 9, which is a nomadic European biennial, and in that edition was held in Genk, a former mining area in Belgium. And the theme was the Industrial Revolution, more specifically coal. And Dawn curated the historical section of that exhibition, and Jeremy was really very much a fellow traveler of that exhibition. And the exhibition here, I think, partly comes out of that experience. So, and Dawn selected writings will soon be published by Writing House. So Jeremy wouldn't need too much introduction to most of you, represented Britain at last year's Venice Biennale, Biennale, and that exhibition has been touring in England since then. It's called English Magic, including being presented at William Morris Gallery in Walthamstow. A major retrospective of his work was presented by Hayward Gallery in 2012 called Joy in People, a title that suggests in everyday terms Jeremy's kind of commitment to a particular kind of social aesthetics. He's as known as much for individual projects as exhibitions, such as Sacrilege from 2012, where he remade Stonehenge as a life-size bouncy castle for Glasgow International, or in a different tone, It Is What It Is, where he did a road trip across America with the ruins of a car that had been exploded by a bomb in Iraq, accompanied by an American veteran, Marine, and an Iraqi translator. And they both gave their perspectives to people as the thing traveled across America. Other projects include Folk Archive with Alan Kane, one of many instances that reveal Jeremy's interest in kind of spontaneous or grassroots creativity as a kind of alternative to, let's say, capitalist mass-produced industrial culture. He, of course, won the Turner Prize in, I think, 2001, shortly after reenacting the Battle of Orgreave in Orgreave itself in Yorkshire, the kind of pivotal moment of the miners' strike. He's made a bat house for bats, of course, in Barnes in London, and he's made films on the fans of Depeche Mode and on George W. Bush's Texas. He also has a small work, if I can call it a small work, upstairs, which is a kind of souvenir from a performance by a look-alike Karl Marx, who was playing the role of a secular Santa Claus in the run-up to Christmas in 2000 and signing Christmas cards with Marxist messages. So I hope you don't miss that, because it's in a study and not everybody kind of gets into our kind of wonderful study, but please go. So perhaps those are the kind of main points by introduction, and now it's a great pleasure to welcome Jeremy and Dawn, who will speak for 45, 50 minutes around slides, and then we'll have maybe 20, 30 minutes for questions. Thank you.
We haven't really rehearsed much of what we're going to talk about, but we're really going to just talk about through images, really, from the show, and just talk quite freely about things. I think, Dawn, that's the case. That's what we decided. And we'll just see how it goes, really. I think that's the best we can do for the moment. I've got a cough, so it might turn into something like a sketch from the Far Show, when you're just, like, coughing incessantly, but I've got sweets here, so hopefully we'll be all right. I think what I was, should I start by saying a few things? I think what I was really wanting to do with this show, which I hope a lot of you have seen, is really just try and make some connection between our lives now and the Industrial Revolution. It's actually, this show is really just going to be about rock music and how rock music has been influenced by an Industrial Revolution. But I got distracted once I looked at certain things and certain ideas and images. So it sort of exploded a little bit and became about lots of things. But there's still a big element about music and the music scene in Britain and how it's been infected by industry and how it's changed us as well. So this is the opening salvo, and I call it a salvo really because this is our masterpiece painting on the left. The Expulsion from Sodom and Gomorrah by John Martin, and I wanted that to sort of start the show and be this real statement of intent. We were trying to get other masterpiece paintings, but as is often the case with shows like this, we only ended up with one. It's quite difficult getting these things, isn't it, Dawn? You would know about this.
Very difficult indeed. And just very briefly, the exhibition that I was involved with for Manifesta 9 at Henk in Belgium was in a former coal, the official building, which was a ruin. And I was trying to borrow things like John Martin's, and looked at the site and said, well, actually, we can't display these works in that place. You will have to build a sort of gallery within the ruin. So we built a gallery in order to put a Martin in, not that one, because I was using the John Martins in a slightly different way from me, which is very interesting. I also began with Martin in the exhibition about the age of coal. It was really to do with the way Martin translated the notion of the sublime, as it were, through the great industrial scenes, yes.
I think for me, what is interesting about work like this is that even though it doesn't look like it's about Victorian England, I see these works as being absolutely about life in Victorian England, about life in cities, where at any moment there could be a riot where a city would be burnt down, like Nottingham or Bristol, where another show is at the moment, where there were riots in the 1830s, where large parts of Bristol were burnt down. But also there was spread of diseases which couldn't be seen. No one really knew where they were coming from. Often they were waterborne. So there are these plagues, basically, these contemporary plagues were happening. So I see Martin's work as being really about the contemporary city and the hellishness of it.
pollution. I mean, he was one of the first, as it were, kind of to show that particular kind of pollution because of coal, only of coal.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll bring that a bit closer. Can you hear Dawn at the back? You can. Okay, that's good. I think what interests us about Martin is that he's one of these artists who's not just into the sort of the Old Testament and so on. He was actually quite prescient in what he was trying to do. I mean, this is a very prescient image, which isn't in the show, of an attempt to sort of make a sort of floodplain or this sort of anti-flooding mechanism for the Thames Valley, I think it was, which obviously is just flooded. He was an engineer by trade, and so he's obsessed with sort of problems, solving problems that have arisen through industry. A lot of them. One was to take noxious gases from coal mines and out of the mines themselves. And most famously was his plans for a sewage system for London. Which is what this drawing is of. This is in the Science Museum. Again, this isn't in the show because they didn't want to lend it, basically.
But it's in the book.
Yes.
And it's sort of wonderful because it's both, incredibly efficient as a piece of engineering, but it's also a grand monument. So it's a very odd sort of Victorian relationship between, an attempt to clean the city up and also display its.
It's very beautiful as well as a drawing.
Yeah.
And weirdly, if you look at a lot of Martin paintings, they have these sort of colonnades and these very deep perspectives, very dramatic perspectives. So there's a huge connection between the two. And I think when you see those drawings, you realise that the paintings are about something else. They're not just about illustrating a story from the Bible. It's about about contemporary fears and also his contemporary fears.
Oh, yes, and he was prescient, and I think the sewage system was very shortly after he died. It was built
by Basil Jett, who took up a lot of what Martin was talking about. Just before that, he was ridiculed openly, and ridiculed even in Parliament for wanting to do this. But actually, what he did was start the process.
There was a cholera epidemic, is that right? Just before.
Yeah.
The early 1840s.
I'm going to sit so I can see everyone. So thousands of people had died, and this was one of his attempted solutions. So I really wanted to start the show with that image, and then make other connections. So this obviously is the rock side of things, clearly. And I think a lot of imagery of rock music, not just the sound, but the imagery, comes from industry. I'll just show you a few things after this. This is a Judas Priest live album in Japan.
And it really does look like that Martin.
It does. It's very dramatic. These figures, they could be like Old Testament prophets, like the one on the left with the long hair and the smoke and everything. So you have the kind of Old Testament feel. But then you have this sort of feel as well, this film Steel, which is a very glamorous look, in a way, a very glamorous, beautiful look at the steel industry from 1945, the film by Jack Cardiff. Filmed in such an amazing way, really very aesthetic view. But then you have images like this, where iron and steel are being made, which this is in the exhibition, of sort of manliness, and this sort of new definition of manliness. So it's not so far away from heavy metal music. And as we all know, and it's almost a cliche now, this music often comes from the parts of Britain where these industries exist. So for me, it's the sort of thing that's always repeated on BBC4, but I just felt that it could be re-repeated, especially when you have the opportunity to put an album cover next to a masterpiece painting or in the same room as one. You start getting these visual connections. It's not just about how things sound, it's actually about how things look. And in a way, this kind of music was almost a replacement for an industrial life for a lot of people. So in the 1980s, when this music was at its absolute height, or late 70s, it was just on the verge of all these factories closing, more or less, or most of them closing. So it's almost a requiem for these times, and a sort of aesthetic version of the reality of working in a mine or a factory or steel or iron plant. So with an exhibition, it's great to be able to put things together. And being an artist, it's probably a little bit different about being an art historian. Can you talk about how an art historian has to approach these kind of things as opposed to an artist, because it is quite different.
Actually, I was just about to ask you how you mutated from an art historian into an artist.
So a similar kind of question.
Well, I can say a little bit about. I mean, just quite a long period separates your experience as an art historian at the Courtauld and mine, and probably yours was a little less narrow than mine was.
It was very narrow, actually.
It was very narrow.
We both went to a university which was very traditional, where it basically taught you to look at drawings, to relate to paintings, and also it was about connoisseurship, about identifying things, really for work in the National Gallery or Christie's, more.
Yeah.
That's how it felt.
Yes, and be able to identify an artist and style and say how much it was going to be sold for.
Yeah.
Or something like that.
So it was about the value of things. But
and so when you got in, well, one got interested in something like the Industrial Revolution, which, you know, it seemed to be part of a necessary understanding of the 18th century, the kind of things we were looking at as budding art historians were just paintings. We didn't see anything that would have been called document or documentary. And that's really changed, I think, now. I mean, I think that the need to see, you know, a great range of visual things in order to understand also the way that the paintings like those by John Martin might relate to other questions, such as health, hygiene, pollution, and so on in the 18th century. And certainly for me, looking at the long period, I mean, from the late 18th century through to the, you know, to the closures, to the incredibly rapid contraction of the mining industry in Europe as a whole, threw a new light on some of the cliches of art history. So, for example, I started looking at Impressionism as a story of pollution, as well as the aesthetics of pollution. So that kind of thing was...
So like these smogs going through towns.
Smogs going through towns.
Yeah, especially in London, all those Monet paintings of
Yeah.
London. Because of steam trains as well.
Steam
obviously.
trains, yes.
I suppose as an artist, though, you're given so much rope, in a way, in a good sense. You're allowed to play around. Whereas as an art historian, you probably are not allowed to play around as much as I am in terms of imagery. If you'd have put that picture of a Judas Priest album cover in your show, it could have, I wouldn't say it would have ended your career necessarily, but it would have been an interesting moment for you in your career, I suspect.
Yes, but you were able to play around. You're able to do those things that I can't.
No.
So, but might like to.
Yes. So Steel, which is, like I said, this beautiful film made really in the style of John Martin, or in this really, paintings like this.
During the 19th century, I mean, sort of middle 19th century towards the end, there was quite a sort of move towards subjects from industrial Britain, exhibited at the Royal Academy. I don't know that this was, because this is a rather exceptional.
It's a bit earlier as well, by self-taught artists.
One of the very first self-taught artists. But modelling it on a kind of, you say in the catalogue, a kind of nativity scene, like a birth of something new.
Yeah.
And yet it's a kind of, it's realism.
Yeah. No, so I do this, and also works by Joseph Wright have a kind of religious feel to them. It's like it's the birth of an idea, or birth of a piece of iron, rather than of a baby, a saviour. But in some ways it is the saviour for some people. Just the lighting, and you're in this sort of quite dark environment, these people crouching around this thing and so on. So I think they learn from that iconography, but they obviously it changes things. This again goes back to rock music, and this the chances and happenstance of rock music. This is the hand of Tony Iommi from Black Sabbath playing guitar, and as you can see, one of those fingers it looks a bit darker. It's because when he was in the factory, he was cutting sheet metal. I mean, even thinking about it makes me flinch. Putting sheet metal through this big cutter, and he cut the tips of his fingers off, and it changed how he played guitar. He had to play a more rhythmic form of guitar playing rather than a lead guitar playing, and it changed music effectively. If you're into rock music, you realise that the way he plays is like no one else up to that moment, and that's through an industrial accident. So that's industry affecting you in a sort of strange way, for the good, strangely enough. Whereas most industrial accidents, there's very little good to be said about them, and we might come on to that later. But that's just one of those strange sort of coincidences. Oh yes, so Brian Ferry. Brian Ferry. I don't know if you've seen the show, you realise we have Brian Ferry's family tree in the exhibition. And going on for, the idea of a coal miner's son is quite a poignant one, and let's face it. And he actually asked me not to do this family tree, even though I'd already done it, and I did it, and it's in the exhibition. So I actually went against his sort of wishes, which is a bit ethically, I don't know where it stands really, but this is the family tree. Unfortunately, you can't read it because of the size of the text, but what I think I was interested in here, and I think you might want to say something about this, Dawn, is of a way of reading someone's heritage through their family, obviously, but also through the jobs they had. And Brian Ferry is one of the most famous examples of someone who's gone from super working class in his birth to virtual aristocracy in one generation, which is very, very unusual, I think. And I wanted to show that, but also the depth of his family, the fact that most of his family are from the same area. They were in the same industry, more or less, in the mining industry. And it's actually a very good way for us as mortals, not in the rock world or whatever, or not famous, to sort of think about our own heritage. And the fact that, almost without exception, all of us come from an industrial, if you're from this country, you'd have come from an industrial past, or your family would have had some sort of industrial jobs. Before that, would have worked on the land, presumably.
Yes, I mean, I don't know how far back, as it were.
It's about 200 years.
200 years, but you have a rather strong sense of it having a beginning and an ending, as if it's like, containing an extraordinary, the most, amazing and influential part of our history, but beginning and an end, because there was that explosion of population. I think you quoted in the book that, is it from 1851? Suddenly, more people live in cities than lived in the countryside.
In the UK.
In the UK.
And that's only recently, and 3 years ago, that happened in the whole world as a whole. But Britain was way ahead, and so depopulated very quickly from the countryside.
And perhaps I don't know how easy it would be to trace, go through the rural records of births and deaths, and they exist, don't they? But many were never recorded, I suppose.
Well, I think it would have been. I'm not sure actually, but I suppose the way these things look is that it's as if all of it, it's like a kind of chemical, like an equation almost. Yeah. All these things added together equal that. That's what I wanted to have. So you have this sort of forward movement, and this is the answer to the question. The question is, what does all this mean? Well, it actually means this man at the end. So it was. I don't think he wanted it. He would. I don't. I think
he didn't want it.
He didn't want it to be seen.
Because he didn't want to be known.
Brian, if you're out there and you're watching this, I'm very sorry, but I'm still a big fan, even though you're not quite a big fan of mine by the sounds of it. But so this is a section about time, and timekeeping and time management. The banner you see is a text that was sent to someone. I actually got this from a. Is that you? I'll wait. Usually you don't wait when people are on the phone. No. That's all right. There, we got it there.
Got it.
Yeah, it's Brian.
It's
Brian.
Brian.
It's Brian Ferry. We're really in really big trouble now with the glam rock police. That hello, today you have day off is from a text message. I got this from a Newsnight did a thing about 0 hours contracts, and they were waiting with someone who was on a 0 hours contract to see if they had work that day, and they were sent that text message when they were just waiting to find out, which I thought was quite. If I'd have known this before, that's what I would have called the show, but we only found out a bit too late, so we kept the title of the show, which we should talk about the title, shouldn't we?
Yes. Yes.
Because actually that is a more relevant title in a sense. What struck me about this was it wasn't even proper English.
I just want to say that,
Yeah.
yes. Do you think it just isn't proper English? It's not a matter of a sort of texting habit. It's just not
I
proper
think
English.
it's just they don't really care, you know. So they're just sending you something, and it just shows a sort of total lack of respect for the person, and just it's just very odd, isn't it?
Also, it's actually quite insulting to say, you know, we're not going to employ you today, and we're not going to give you any money. You want a day off,
Yeah.
as if it's a holiday.
Yeah, and it's paid or something.
Yeah.
But what I wanted to do in this section was something about timekeeping, and about I mean, timekeeping is obviously something that's very important to do in music. But when you hear the sounds of factories, I mean, these are sounds that people have never heard before. When they went into a factory, you can only imagine the shock of walking into a factory for the first time, being deafened and having to lip read people, and just hearing these sounds and the regularity of it. And then not only that, you have to keep up. You have to keep up with these machines. And so that was something that interested me, sort of the trauma of that. So that's where we have some contemporary sort of time control and timekeeping apparatus, but also the one on the left, which I don't know, Dawn, do you want to talk about?
No, can you, what, the clock?
So, yes.
Oh, you explain it.
It's a, well,
Yeah.
I need the book actually, I should just read out what I wrote about it, but it's a clock that was used in a mill, and there's two times. One is the time, as you would know it, and the second is the work rate of the mill going round and of people working.
So it's kind of production time.
Yes.
Yeah.
And only when you do the production time can you leave. So even if you go over your working hours, you have to finish only when the other clock catches up. Which is kind of interesting. There's something has happened. There's a big class action suit at McDonald's at the moment in America. Something we probably haven't heard about much in Britain, where you clock on and off at McDonald's, but after you've clocked off, you're made to tidy up all the mess in the restaurant. And they've been doing this for years and years, apparently, tens of years. And they've finally been, because they don't allow unions, it's very difficult to sort of catch them on this, but they've finally been caught out on it, and they're facing one of the biggest class action suits in America, or in the world, with workers from the last 30 years. It's going to cost them billions and billions of dollars, because they've been doing this practice. So
one of the things you talk about in there is also the habit that some employers had of altering the actual time of the clock so that it you know, as it were, it was running slow.
yeah,
And the possession of an actual stopwatch was really frowned upon. People were, you know, the workers.
you could be
household
sacked.
You could be sacked.
You could be sacked for having a watch.
Mm.
But often when miners earned enough money, the first thing they did was buy a watch, because then they could be in control of their time. So that's the clock on the left, which had this mechanism which you can't see here, the mechanism that was up top with all these sort of bands and sort of cogs and so on, which was directly connected to the mill, to the wheel. And then on the right we have the dreaded Motorola hand. I apologise, some of these slides aren't quite as sharp as they could be. And it's called the WT440, which is basically a device that's used and worn in warehouses, and Amazon use them, or similar ones, where you go along and you do the stock check with this thing on the end of your finger. But not only is it helping you to stock check, it's actually keeping track of your work rate and your speed and how far you've walked. And if you're not going fast enough, it will start sending...
Electric shock.
Yes, sort of. Send you messages and then send you more stern messages and so on. And it's all being logged and kept somewhere else. But so it's basically keeping track of you. This is just a new way of keeping track of the worker. So I just thought time and time management was something I should look at. And here are some pictures from the Amazon plant, Amazon factory. This is a life-size image of one of the workers, and around it has quotes by other people saying how much they enjoy working at Amazon, which might be the case, or maybe it is the case. But it's a very harsh working environment, and it's all about reward and so on. Not in like the environment during the Industrial Revolution. And you might not be employed from one day to the next. It really depends on how you're behaving and your attitude. So very casual employment law and so on, which again is not so different from the Industrial Revolution. There's two other images. I mean, the one on the right, I felt had some connection to John Martin, to this idea of the sublime.
The scale, the sort of endlessness of it, and both the endlessness of those spaces and buildings, as well as the noise that overwhelmed people. I mean, that was the definition of the sublime, I suppose, something that defeated your reason to take it in, and that, the distance in that Amazon one. I mean, I'm trying to sort of take account of the quantity is just
like the whole amazing. World is there in products.
All the books.
Yeah. Now, this is almost an emblematic character for the exhibition. He's we're going to spend a lot of time on Adrian, aren't we, talking about him, because we love him so much, and we're going to show a clip of him in a minute. But when I was thinking about the show, I suppose the exhibition is really about how Britain went from being an industrial country to being one that's more or less post-industrial in terms of how we earn our living. I know there's still industry left, but nothing like it was 50 years ago, or let alone 100 years ago. And I just felt that this image summed up the change that Britain had been through, just by, not really by accident, but by one man organising a photo shoot about his life. That's a bit more clear. You can see it. It's an image of Adrian Street, who's a wrestler. He made a lot of money in the 70s as a sort of quite outrageous character as a wrestler. Going back to the pit head that he'd worked in that pit, and having his photograph taken with his father, which you might think is that's a nice thing for someone to do, go back and show his dad what he made of himself. But actually, he hated his father, hated the men in the lift there, hated Wales, hated the coal mining industry, hated everything about industrial Britain. So really, he was going to show them what he'd made. No, he was going to show them what he'd made for himself, and just saying, look what I've done, you peasants, basically. I've made this life for myself, and you're still coal miners. And I see it as a prediction of what Britain would become, or what Britain was becoming at that point, as a post-industrial, entertainment-based, service-based economy. But just Adrian, in his genius, basically, instinctively realised this when he had that photograph taken. And it's a picture I could look at forever, basically. Not that we will look at it forever tonight, I promise. But it's one that just gives so much, really. For me, it has many art historical references. I don't know if you want to talk about anything. For me, it's more like, it's like William Blake. It's like Jerusalem, the poem Jerusalem, you know. When it's about someone coming from the future, a Christ-like figure, and showing the people in the dark satanic mills, the brightness and light and salvation almost.
I don't think that's how they saw it, though.
Who?
The miners.
What, in this picture? Oh no, they hated it. They couldn't bear him.
They couldn't bear him.
No, but they probably just thought, who is this person who we used to beat up in the mine? Yeah. Those guys used to beat him up and cut his hair when he was 15. He told me, and so that's why he went back and was making a lot of money. But for me, it has that sort of resonance.
That he was able to get away.
But but also, and then he comes back, and it's the prodigal son, really, but he's done nothing wrong in his eyes, and never will have done anything wrong. But I just see it as this almost religious photograph. So I think what I was going to read out doesn't really fit that. You can read out that's a really good piece. Dawn was going to read out something about miners dressing.
Well, it was, I mean, in this book was like full of treasures and full of wonderful, wonderful stuff, which is Francis Klingender's Art and the Industrial Revolution. And he's read all the sort of documentary and memoirs about the early years of the coal, a whole lot, cotton as well, but coal industry in particular. And then the people writing about, people visited areas like Coalbrookdale and so on. It like almost like a tourist, and the middle classes, were stunned at the kind of the difference. There's a different sort of person altogether. And one of the, this is from a description in 1844, Hare's sketches. Hare was Thomas Hare was an artist, and someone called Ross wrote a sort of text to go with it. And this is strange because it's somehow not at all how one thinks of Pitman. This is 1840s. And this is Pitman off duty on their rare kind of holiday, on a Sunday, I suppose. In their dress, they often affect to be gaudy and are fond of clothes of flaring colours. Their holiday waistcoats, called by them posy jackets, are frequently of very curious patterns, displaying flowers of various dyes, and their stockings mostly of blue, purple, pink, or mixed colours. A great part of them have their hair very long, which on work days is either tied in a queue or rolled up in curls, but when dressed in their best attire is commonly spread over their shoulders. Some of them wear 2 or 3 narrow ribbons round their hats placed at equal distances, in which it is customary with them to insert 1 or more bunches of primroses or other flowers.
It's rather nice, isn't it?
I just thought there was this kind of, perhaps this sort of suppressed desire to actually contrast as strongly as possible, you know, your daily appearance as sort of totally blackened and dirty with this amazing explosion of colour. That's what I thought.
I mean, you're right. It totally makes sense, doesn't it? Totally makes sense. Just going back to that idea of all these people visiting Britain. Well, I mean, people came from abroad to witness the Industrial Revolution, and there are incredible descriptions of scenes that people, you can't work out whether they're very impressed by it, but they're horrified by it at the same time. So it's very interesting. There's some great descriptions of people going on a train for the first time and describing how a train works and the speed at like 20 miles an hour and how...
Really fast.
Yeah, and how incredible it is. But, so these descriptions are incredibly vivid. And often they're very apocalyptic. They're about the earth just being upturned and fires in the earth and so on. So again, it takes you back to those John Martin images.
The realisation of hell.
Yeah. This is it. And this is progress. We're going to show the first 3 or 4 minutes of the Adrian Street film.
I could be a tulip, I could be a man. The only way of knowing is to catch me if you can. You may suppose what you want to suppose, but I'm a sweet transvestite with a broken nose. I've got to be royalty, my blood must be blue. I'm king of the ring and queen of it too. Have you ever seen muscles on a rose? I'm just a sweet transvestite with a broken nose. I'll kiss you or I'll kick you, that's what I like the best. I'm as tough as Marciano and as sexy as Mae West. I'm as cute as Shirley Temple and as fast as Bruce Lee. I could kill a man, eventually. If you're a he, she or it, you'd better answer my calls. I'm like King Kong with lipstick. I'm like Fay Ray with balls. I wear mink and sable when the cold wind blows. I'm just a sweet transvestite with a broken nose. This will be somewhere in the region of the 15,000th time I've walked out in front of an audience. I'm actually making my own personal history tonight because I've wrestled in 7 different decades, 2 different centuries, 2 different millenniums. At 16 years of age, I'm walking in the ring for the first time. It was like an unbelievable dream come true. I couldn't even feel my feet touching the ground. I felt like I was walking on a cloud.
Adrian Street, who's just come back from Africa. And he's got quite a tan on him too, as colour set owners will notice probably. That is not makeup.
If I'd been born in a different age, like 1,500, 2,000 years ago, something like that, I would have been a gladiator. I would have been a Roman gladiator out of choice. Not because I was a slave and made to. That's what I would have loved to have done. And the thing is that professional wrestling, it wasn't just actually fighting somebody and bettering somebody that appealed to me, as all that did, but it was dressing up to do it.
So in the show, you see a sort of 20 and a 30-minute film I made about Adrian, because he's such an extraordinary character, and really just stems from this photograph I'm obviously quite obsessed with. Because when I saw it, I just thought, what is really happening here? I realised it was a photo shoot of some sort. I need to get to the bottom of it really, and he describes it in the film. But I just see it as probably the photograph, the post-war photograph taken in Britain for me, the most important one really. The music, by chance. Should I talk about the music? You might be interested in this. I was really struggling with the film and what to do with it, because I felt it was far too long. So by chance, I bought a CD of music from ballets by Nijinsky. I think Nijinsky, yeah, it's a Ballet Russe CD, and I've heard that very sort of atmospheric music you just heard, and I used it, and then I realised it was called Echo and Narcissus, which is perfect because he's a total narcissist. So I was very happy with that. But the music really takes it somewhere else. It doesn't keep it in a sort of industrial context. This is really a pivotal image for the show, and so that's why it's used everywhere, more or less. It's used in every sort of way I can manage to. This is again a way without making it, well, in a way it makes it very obvious about this connection between industry and music, and the music industry and rock music. It's the jukebox. I hope it was working when you came, if you went to see the show, because it's a bit temperamental. It's full of 7-inch singles, the jukebox, but the majority of them are actually just sounds from factories. So it's making a very kind of clear comparison between rock music and the sounds of factories, where a lot of those early rock stars at least worked, or environments around which they lived at least. So again, it's that idea for where when an artist curates a show, you get a bit more freedom to play around. It's probably something that, again, that Dawn, you probably would get into a bit of trouble if you did that with your sort of academic colleagues.
Oh well, no. I think nowadays people have kind of, they've realised that exhibitions can be much bolder than they used to be, and incorporate all kinds of different materials. Sound. I mean, sound's obviously always been an issue in exhibitions, but I think here, you play the music
and it kind of goes around.
Fits in, it goes around.
It was interesting. We started the evening with some feedback, which is a kind of an industrial sounding thing, I would say. It's quite appropriate. You did very, very well there, Alex, I have to say, to make that happen. Also in this room are some ballads. We're going to read out from a ballad in a minute. It's a saucy one. And then, but also there's these pictures that are from Manchester. They're actually taken in South Wales in the iron industry, of women working in the iron industry in South Wales. Which again is one of those finds. I mean, you must have that experience when you had photographs in your show that were amazing of workers.
We had, I mean, it's actually quite a famous set of photographs by Arthur Mumby, which you may know, particularly of pit girls. Women and children under 12 or something like that, I can't remember the exact figure, had been banned from going down the mines from about the middle 19th century. Previously, I mean, sort of too horrific even to think about the kind of lives that they were leading. But because some of the tunnels were so small that only children could go through them, and pulling loads of coal behind them.
That's right.
But the photographs were incredibly important. A sort of moment of kind of revealing what was going on in a hitherto sort of hidden and strange environment of the mines. But the Mombi photographs of the pit women, he obviously actually really liked these pit girls dressed up in the working clothes.
Did he have a bit of a thing about them then?
He had a bit of a thing about them.
Right.
Yeah.
These are slightly different.
It looks like
they're less
different.
posed. Are the Mombi ones quite posed?
The Mombi, yes, some of them are taken with the girls at the pit head, but many of them are photographs of them transferred into a studio environment.
Oh, right.
It was
So
very
this is-
strange.
this
So
is
you
quite
have
similar.
a rather sort of, quite some decorative wallpaper or something, and then these girls with piles of coal in front of them, obviously piled up in front. Yes, they're very much posing. These seem to be these are more like, they are sort of documents of...
There are, and they're into, some are, like, this is in a studio, but others are of the women after they've been breaking rocks. That's what their main job was, to break rocks for the ironworks. So almost like hard labour, what you'd call hard labour now, if you would. So certain kinds of prisons, not necessarily in the UK. But I think those photographs actually alerted the public. They were quite scandalous when these photographs were seen a lot of the time.
Yes. And look, I'm just thinking back to your family trees. The women were working there because their families had, traditionally done those jobs. Isn't that right?
Yeah.
There was tremendous continuity within the family, within the group.
I think there were, and there was always the main worry at the time was that women, if they were working in factories, it wasn't so much the work they were doing, it's the fact they didn't have time to raise families and look after their husbands. They didn't have time to cook food for them when they got home. Not the fact that the work was absolutely sort of totally harsh and traumatizing. So I think for a show, what's interesting about these pictures was they weren't bought by the fine arts department at Manchester Art Gallery. They were bought by the costume department because they were very interested in what the women were wearing. And then, as you can see in this picture, they were wearing these bonnets which were decorated with buttons and pins and so on. And that was really the sort of, maybe it was the fashion, but the only way they could express any sort of individuality by having these bonnets. So I was, but I thought they were, that's why I called the this section the shit old days. After that, the good old days. Anyone old enough to remember the good old days? It was this terrible series on BBC One on a Thursday night. I actually remember when it was, after the 9 o'clock news, which was a sort of very sentimental look at Victorian life, with those sort of music hall songs, everyone dressed up as soldiers and in their lovely clothes and so on. But obviously for the majority of people, it was more, this was probably more an accurate reflection of their daily lives.
It's true. It's sort of quite shocking to think about these photographs in the context of that interest in categorising, that sort of costumbrista, I know it's in Spanish, I can't think what the English word is at the moment, but there was a real fashion for, a typical lamplighter or a typical, blacksmith and so on, that just categories of people, and then, then you began to get these photographs.
And you have hierarchies as well.
Hierarchies.
Because this would be pretty towards the bottom, I imagine. This is a series of paintings. I love this series. I mean, in a way it relates to the pictures of the women, the photographs of the women, of workers in a single factory in South Wales. They've done about 20 years before. Again, it's not so clear, but it has what looks like every job within the factory, someone's been painted. And in a very similar style. Again, these things, I mean, they're probably not that valuable, weirdly. If you were to buy this, you probably wouldn't have to spend that much money, but I think in terms of social history, they're priceless.
And who painted them?
It was a local artist whose name escapes me, it's in the book, who was sort of semi-professional, basically. But then when you start painting things like this, you realise the value of this sort of work.
But I mean, coming back to the question about art history and artists, there were thousands of artists, I think that's fair to say, who were local and who painted for commission, who would paint people or horses or dogs, you know, throughout. But isn't that true?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's virtually folk art, isn't it?
It's a kind of folk art.
Or vernacular.
Yes.
Well, these definitions are really tough because then you have to start defining what you mean by folk art or vernacular. But it's basically semi-professional or professional local artists.
It's professional local artists. So
Yeah.
it's not amateurs.
No.
And it's not people just doing it in their spare time. It's people who are making their living. I think that's probably true to say for
that weirdly,
someone like that.
this kind of work is more important than a Gainsborough or Joshua Reynolds in terms of what they're saying about life at that time.
Well,
I think.
yeah, I think so. Because I think they're seeing it cleared, if you like, of all sorts of, you know, historical tropes about how you know, represent a group or represent single people who are sitting for their portrait. It's not quite like that.
No.
It's something different.
And also they're all named, so we know who all these people are. I can't read some of these rules, but anyway, this is basically going back to that idea of a 0 hours contract. This is not too dissimilar. It basically says that you can be fired at any time for virtually any crime in their eyes, which is even just like talking to someone or taking too long going to the toilet. Going to the toilet seemed to be a huge deal in the Industrial Revolution about what happened in the toilet. But if you took any material in with you, you could be any kind of cotton or straw. You could be fired if you went in with other people, or if people went in with you or followed you in. It was a very sort of dangerous thing, going to the toilet. It was quite interesting. And so like about at least 4 or 5 of these rules are about going to the toilet, and also bringing people, strangers, into the factory, talking too much, all those kinds of things.
Not smoking.
Not smoking, yeah. Or smoking. Yeah. This is sort of the last bit we're going to talk about. When we were researching the show, I wanted to have sort of folk music, which was based in cities because everyone assumes that folk songs are just about life in the countryside and the sort of idyllic life, or the terribleness of life in the countryside. But obviously folk songs and the idea about folk music actually did go into the cities, even though it became superseded by other forms of music maybe. So as you can see with this one, this is about I think this is a young woman called Sally Slime, Juno Grimfield. A lot of them are about working in coal mines and about how tough it is in coal mines, but also mills, from the perspective of like a young person or a woman often. A lot of them also, which is quite interesting, are about moving to the city and what it's like to move to the city. There are these cautionary tales, and they're basically telling people, their way of almost spreading information about actually what will happen to you is you'll meet a woman and she'll end up taking you back to her place, but she's actually a prostitute and she'll try and take all your money from you, or something will happen and you'll have your pocket picked, or you'll be beaten up in the street. So they're ways of they're very interesting sort of ways of spreading news, really. And we thought we'd end the talk with a very unusual one. We'll see if we can get it up. Oh, here's another one. This is about prison in Salford. So there's a lot about social justice as well, and about people being put in prison for various reasons, but also about uprisings in different parts of the country. And so they're not just quite frivolous pop songs, they have a kind of protest element to them as well.
Yes.
Do you want to say a few words? I'm going to get my reading glasses so I can read this properly.
Well, I was just wondering about how these were distributed. I mean, they were printed and quite widely distributed.
They were sold in the street, and they're very cheap.
Like broadsheets.
Exactly. They were ripped off. They were printed off in a big roll. They'd rip off the song you wanted, and they'd say, "We've got the new song about this person or this thing happening or a disaster." Often, a lot of them are about disasters, like in coal mines, and sometimes there would be ways of making money for the families whose husbands were killed often, or male members of the family that were killed. And the guys who were walking around might sing a few lines, but he wouldn't sing the whole song, because then you'd have heard it. So he'd sing a few lines as an example. So there's a huge, rich culture there. Very interesting culture about live music. And
absolutely. But I was also thinking there's a kind of tradition of radical printers, isn't there? I mean, whoever controlled the printing press in the 17th and the 18th and 19th century was incredibly powerful and very, very important.
It's like controlling the internet.
Well, that's right. And I don't know much about it, but I imagine there were radical printers who were producing these.
And a lot of these prints had to have the publisher at the bottom of them. They had to, then this one doesn't, because it's one of those prints, I think. It's about these people that are going to go to either be executed, I think, or go to Australia. And so most of them, by law, had to have who'd printed it. So it could be traced back and you could be arrested for sedition or whatever, or libel. But the more controversial ones were anonymous. So I'm not quite sure if they probably weren't sold publicly. So we're going to try and read out, or I'm going to try and read out, the last, this is really the last thing we're going to do, is the one on the far left, called the Newberry Loom. The one in the middle, after its trip to Manchester, is again about someone coming to Manchester and getting ripped off. There's a fantastic one, Oldham Streets at dinner time. That's lovely. That's about women, mainly women, going out of mills at lunchtime and then going shopping and buying sort of small, like ribbons and little things to adorn themselves with. So it's a kind of beginning of, of shopping culture.
Shopping, yes. And some of them are set to well-known tunes, aren't they?
Yes.
I mean, you can,
they do actually say,
that one would be.
Some of them actually say to the tune of or whatever. So there's another great one, which is so contemporary again, or it shows that life hasn't really changed much in these towns. It's about Saturday night in Bury or something, about everyone on the streets drunk and so on. So but I will read out some of the New Loom. I'm going to do it in a very, I'm not going to sing it or do it in an accent, but it's basically an erotic poem about a man meeting a woman, and then it uses all the language of weaving to create this sort of erotic situation.
It's like the weaving loom industrial equivalent of
Yes.
the milkmaid.
The milkmaid and the naughty farmer. Yeah. So it's quite embarrassing to read it because it just seems so rude. She took me and showed me her loom, but down on her warp did appear. The lamb Jackson leads put in motion, I levelled her loom to a hair. My something run well in her lathe, my tread it did work up and down, my level stood close to her breast beam, this time I was weaving her loom. And then it just goes on and on, and there's like 7, so it's a sort of carry-on sort of thing. When I did a little film for this exhibition, and I did, and for Newsnight, which is in the exhibition, and I got famous people to read out accounts of their hometowns in the Industrial Revolution. So I got Jarvis Cocker to do something, and Noddy Holder from Slade read out something about Birmingham, these amazing descriptions of the sky on fire and so on. And I wanted Sean Ryder, who some of you must know from Happy Mondays, to read out this in his sort of very thick accent, but also I thought it was right up his street because it's absolutely filthy. Okay, I'll read you another little bit. Her laver went bang to and fro. My main treader did still keep in tune. My pickers went nickety-knack all the time I was squaring her loom. Anyway, thank you very much for being here on that bombshell. I think Alex is going to come and join us for a few minutes, and then we'll have some questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, the two of you, for such a flowing and fascinating meeting of minds, I think. We've got about half an hour for questions, and I'll pass over to you all very, very quickly, because I'm sure there are a lot of questions. But maybe I could kind of kick off by saying, or putting to the two of you, and perhaps to begin with, Jeremy, I mean, as long as I've known your work, you've been haunted by the Industrial Revolution. You know, you're, I guess, a sort of, you know, at least an adult of the post-industrial age. And, you know, in your work, and I think this is probably also an aspect of your scholarship in this area, your exhibition making, that, however, despite being so recent, that this is almost a sort of act of archaeology. It kind of goes beyond the kind of truism that it's important to know one's past. There's a sense of kind of exhuming something. I mean, just in Nottingham, the that famous view from the castle that you see in the film Saturday Night, Sunday Morning, which I think is 1960, in that scene, you see all these smoking chimney stacks and so on. That's now retail parks, or the Raleigh factory is now a university campus, and indeed a lot of art spaces have colonized former factories and use the idea of the factory, beginning with Warhol in a way, as a kind of metaphor for creative production, but perhaps participate in this kind of effacing of the past. And it's almost as if the industrial era, despite being so recent to us, is this kind of ghost-like thing, almost like the communist past is in post-communist countries, where the culture of industrialization is actually kind of effaced. And it's almost state policy to efface it and to create that amnesia. And I realize, of course, that you're not trying to summon up the good old days.
No,
but what is the, what is this sort of overwhelming cultural, social, political, individual importance to kind of, let's say, exhume this thing?
It's a big question.
Yeah, general.
I can't. That's not a yes or no answer, is it at all? I think because it ended so badly for so many people in the 80s, that way of life, and the 70s, so violently and so unpleasantly, and also I come from that background. You wouldn't think it maybe from my upbringing, but like I said, most of us all do. And I think maybe because it was hidden or not spoken of, or whatever you want to, however you put it, that means it's something that should be looked at and appreciated or looked at in a slightly different way. I didn't really learn it at school. I was taught history very badly at school, so dull, and obviously history is not boring at all. And so maybe it's another way of looking at history. I wouldn't say bringing it to life, but just trying to make it a little bit more relevant to us now. See how things have changed, but also how things haven't changed at all, like with these songs. And they just show people don't change. Human nature does not change, really. We're still interested in the same things, more or less. It's filthy poems and so on. But I think that's why I'm interested in it. And it's so rich culturally.
Yes, I was thinking of something you said on a clip on YouTube or somewhere I was looking at this morning about the Battle of Orgreave, about that you really made it because you were still angry. And I was very, because people talk about reenactment and so on, but you felt still that was relatively recent, and you felt that remembering it was not just a matter of sort of archaeological exhuming or nostalgia or something, but it was actually quite immediate. And yeah.
Well, that was definitely done to bring up something that had been almost suppressed of the end of the miners' strike, I felt. And if I was angry about it, I can imagine how the people who were in the mines, people involved in the miners' strike, felt about it. They felt really angry, basically, and I just felt it was something that needed to be looked at again. So that is, I suppose that's what I was saying about the end, things ending really badly, really violently and very unpleasantly for a lot of people. So, but it's just the whole richness of the culture of Industrial Revolution, and just the whole shockingness, the shock of it, and the trauma of it, for people to go from the countryside into the factory must have just been an incredible experience. And it happened to all of our ancestors, more or less. And yet it's not really known that much about, I don't think. So, and I think the problem in Britain is because of the way we look at ourselves and class systems and so on. We know a lot about how people who are wealthy lived. That's very well documented, but not as much about people who were really not wealthy at all, which is more or less the majority of the population. So.
Yes. And it's also quite, well, I'm just thinking about quite a kind of radical movement in my university in the very early days, when everyone, all the students did a kind of common first year, and they all had to take a class on the Enlightenment. And of course, in a way, what one's talking about with the Enlightenment, is sort of history of ideas and sort of positive thinking of that, secular thing, actually more or less coincides with the Industrial Revolution. So it's for me, in a way, working on that exhibition about coal was like seeing the other side of what I had thought about in terms of this notion of a great revolution in thought.
It's interesting, it's called enlightenment with light,
quite.
and all these people down mines in sort of pitch darkness, or cities turn black through pollution and smoke and so on. But it wouldn't have been possible without that what they would have called progress, industrial progress, and the money made from it.
It was all, yes.
But I guess we should kind of remember that the kind of common sense assumption is that art, and particularly fine art and industry, were opposite things. And if you think of the kind of great collections of the North, and generally they're made up of things, paintings, that make no reference or even conjure up direct opposite fantasies. You know, if you think of the Pre-Raphaelites' interests in the medieval, for example, you know, artisanship, or great romantic landscapes untouched by pollution. The overwhelming move from industrial profit to art is one of kind of eclipsing it, or kind of laundering it in a kind of host of very romantic images that ironically are not dissimilar to some of the kind of stylishness, you know, the politics of style you find in kind of industrial culture, and that leads to a kind of generation of pop musicians.
Yes, I mean, there are very, very few depictions, paintings of interiors of factories. I don't know of many. I mean, I tried to find some. I mean, that Klingender book you have, there's a lot of drawings and prints and so on, but there's very little on the grand scale. I suppose the Great Exhibition was a moment where Britain could show its prowess, its industrial prowess, but not in terms of factory life. It was the products. Yes, people who made their money from that probably didn't want to be reminded so much about that, so they did go for a sort of fantasy, I suppose.
And in a way that continues to today, of course. You know, well, I won't give concrete examples, but you know, it's amazing.
Because you're being filmed. You could have gone about
but they're
art collectors.
You know, the profits of post-industrialism, you know, transformed into the acquisition of art that is often diametrically different and celebrates, you know, individual expression, say. Or
Often the most right-wing people who collect art collect the most way out art we've ever seen, and art that actually has nothing to do with their own personal politics, but they like purchasing it and owning it and having power over it. I'm sort of making a big generalization now, but I think, you know, this does happen. So they're very enlightened, a lot of art collectors, but in America especially, they're incredibly right-wing. So that's quite a shock to find someone who buys great art who has nothing in common with you at all, or you feel you have nothing in common with.
Well, I'm just thinking about. It's not really relevant to what you were saying, but that I think that, as Jeremy said at the beginning about that John Martin painting of the apocalyptic vision, was actually quite. I would have thought probably recognisable people as an allegory of Victorian Britain and town. So I think there's more. I think there's sort of, as it were, there's a more contemporary tension in a lot of the romantic landscapes, because of course, you know, people very quickly picked up on the romantic and picturesque possibilities of the industrial landscapes. Quite a lot of time, and but very strange. And we're so used to a rather sort of black and white opposition between urban and country, which is not really relevant to a lot of these, because a lot of these factories are actually in rather beautiful rural places, and so you've got much more intermingling, I think, and strange juxtapositions of the rural and the industrial, quite often in the de Luteborg landscapes, for example.
Because most coal mines are not in towns; they're in little villages, basically.
Yes, and of course, perhaps more so here than in other parts of Europe, where mining. I'm afraid I'm talking again about mining in particular, so it's, but it's perhaps less true of other industries, but where mining has also more or less collapsed. But here, because it was so early, and therefore most of the mining areas and the coalfields didn't have those very grand buildings that you get in Belgium and northern France, more or less have been erased from the landscape, and there's almost nothing left to see except when the very few little miners that have survived.
I think there's two mines. I mean, there are 3 mines left in Britain now, and there's a mining museum near Wakefield. And I think there's another mine that English Heritage own, and they use it for filming purposes. So that's more or less it. And there's open cast, obviously, which is weirdly open cast is a very old-fashioned form of mining. You've kind of gone back to that.
So we should open up to questions from the audience. And we have 2 roving mics. If you could just wait till the mic arrives at you, because we're filming, so everyone can hear. Just hands up.
It's an awkward 30 seconds. All right.
I just wondered whether, because obviously you were trained as an art historian, whether this feels a lot less academic, in a sense that art history has become so academic that even people, actually can't understand what art historians are talking about.
Talking about Dawn now, are you? Well, Dawn.
I just feel that maybe in a sense, you're leaving the world of art history. Is that what it's about?
This show? Or me as an artist?
As an artist, because you obviously made some kind of transition from that background. I mean, it still seems to be part of your practice, but it's,
it can be, yeah.
Didn't follow the route.
Didn't follow a traditional route. I knew as soon as I started trying to work in a gallery, I realised I could never do it. This is a story I tell all the time, but I might as well tell it again. I was a technician in a gallery on Cork Street when Cork Street was the place to be, and on my first day I burnt a David Hockney print. On my first day, on the morning of my first day, I burnt a David Hockney print and didn't tell anyone, and just put it in the racks and just walked away. Not from the job. I stayed in the job for 6 months, which is in itself was something of a miracle. But that's nothing really to do with your question. But I couldn't. I've always liked art. I went to a school that wasn't wasn't particularly artistic, but also the art teacher didn't particularly like me. So I was sent to do pottery, and I didn't get beyond like the age of 11 drawing. So I might have. I wouldn't have been very good at art college. I'm not a very good technical person, but I loved art and I loved being around it. So I love museums. So it's natural for me to be in a museum and do things like this. I'm at ease with it. I'm very at ease with doing these things, and I'm not intimidated by museums or collections or imagery like this. That's my.
Thank you. Hi. Apologies for turning up late. I do apologise. I was at another exhibition around mental health and art just down the road. I'd rather talk about, very briefly, about mining rather than art. Is that possible?
Yeah.
Okay. Are you aware of the campaign at the moment to save Thoresby Colliery?
I've heard of it.
You're aware of it. I just wondered whether you would be interested in getting involved. In terms of, okay,
kind of no. After a talk.
Yeah. Okay, well, everybody else might
come
want
and
to
see me after the talk. And
certainly, but I'll give you the email address, and everybody else might be interested in becoming involved in it as well.
That's a question here.
Hi, thanks very much. I thought the question Alex asked about, like, I think what is it about artists, and it's not just Jeremy, I think they're sort of trying to exhume the sort of relevance of our industrial past, I think at this point. And I think, I don't know, what sort of kind of interesting for me is, through all the sort of brutality of the Industrial Revolution, one small miracle came out of it, which was collective bargaining. And the power of that, I think, shocked most of the industrialists in Britain. And then I think in some ways maybe the feeling for me is that we're exhuming this industrial past because it's also a requiem for collective bargaining, which of course was crushed by Thatcher and the Tories. And I feel maybe sometimes that's why we're sort of raking over the coals a little bit.
Maybe. I mean, there's not much about politics directly about politics in the show. I want to keep that out. There's not much even about the great riots that happened or the great movements. I just couldn't cover the whole thing. I think what for me is interesting, when you read about people living in towns for the first time in their lives, thousands of people were living in close proximity to each other, in Britain at least, if not tens of thousands, and that's how ideas spread and how people sort of start movements. And I thought that's a very interesting thing about how cities became ungovernable quite quickly, always seemed to, and people sort of formed movements and strange churches and sects and cults and all these kinds of things. And of course that's probably where this idea comes from, sort of organisation of human beings on a bigger scale than had ever been seen before. Unlike in a little village or a hamlet, you can't really do that, but when you're around these people, it's an interesting moment in Britain, very interesting moment for human beings, basically, for human evolution.
But in your work on the Industrial Revolution and maybe coal mining in particular, there's always a tension between what Leah describes as kind of remembrance of a more collective social spirit and the individual standing out and not being able to be part of it. I guess Adrian Street being the
He just couldn't handle it.
ultimate example.
Yeah, I mean, he just...
Or some of these pop stars, you know, they're kind of forced out of it, or they force themselves. They're escaping.
He wasn't, you know, a lot of people went to art college, that was their route out in the 60s or 50s. There was a moment when if you were working class and talented, art college was actually a very good place to go to. And that's where, you know, about 50% of the great bands of the 60s came from art colleges, and the other 50% came from factories. These two places. It's quite unusual. But Adrian, I mean, talking about him personally, he hated his father, and everything his father represented was everything he didn't want to be. So he didn't know his father until he came home from the Second World War, because he was so young. His father had been in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. Comes back and then goes into the, I mean, what an awful life, basically, you know, from a Japanese prisoner of war camp back into the mine. And he obviously beat him and was really, really very violent towards him, and that's probably what made him possibly what made him a violent person, but also made him hate everything that his father represented, that whole culture and the work. So that was I think that's what spurred him on. And still does, actually. He still hates his father and still talks very fond terms about how much he hates him. So if you see the film, you'll realise it's still the great motivation is childhood, as it is for, I think, a lot of artists. What you're interested in as a child just continues with you.
You mentioned title in relation to that question.
I have a title. The title is All That Is Solid Melts Into Air, which is a translation from the German. Remind me, I think it's the communist. It's Karl Marx wrote this, and he's writing about capitalism, about its ability to change. As I understand it, change its sort of nature and its shape, and to adapt. But I think it might be a mistranslation as well, because there is talk that it's from A Midsummer Night's Dream as well. It's from a line of Midsummer Night's Dream, the stuff that dreams are made of. So but it's a phrase that I liked because I was thinking about how is it that Britain has changed from one that dealt in iron and steel, these big, heavy objects and these heavy industry, into air, which was the music industry. So it's a kind of earlier idea of a title for a show that was going to be slightly different. So it's how we've gone from making things to making things that are literally in the ether, that you can't touch.
Yeah, it's from the Communist Manifesto.
That's what I thought.
And it's quite interesting because it's, unlike you, I think, Marx and Engels would have been enthusiastic modernizers. They actually saw capitalism as a revolutionary force, and they saw urbanization and industrialization as rescuing the population from rural idiocy, as they put it. And that spirit, if you like, informs what we might characterize as modernism. And it seems to me that this exhibition and your work generally, as far as I know it, has a rather amodernistic spirit in the sense that it relates to a critical attitude towards capitalism because it seems to have destroyed some kind of real or imagined community that existed before then. And in a way, that's okay if you can, by doing this, recreate a community. But if you can't, then it's just sentimental ideology.
Is that a question or a statement?
It's a statement.
It's a good statement. That could be, it could be true though. I mean, I live in a city. I don't want to live in the countryside. I don't want to go back to that. I mean, the fact that people were willing to go into cities and work in factories must have meant something. There was work there, and they were sick of living in little villages and not having contact with other human beings and only knowing 7 people or whatever it was. So it's not really, I don't think it's really a critique of the Industrial Revolution, because it's actually quite exciting. The culture of it I find quite exciting, and the idea of these new cities forming, even though they would have been, for us, they would have been hellish to live in. It was obviously a moment of great change and disruption. And I find, you know, just looking at these songs for me are about as close as you're going to get to meeting someone who is there and the kind of what it felt like to be there, really, and some of the descriptions. So I'm quite into history.
Me, but just in the way that you talk about this, you deflect from your own art and your own role in things. In your own work, other projects, there's a kind of invisibility about your involvement in producing these things. And that's actually quite amodernistic as well, because the modernistic tradition is really much say, well, this is depiction, and here am I doing the depiction, and here is the, and I'm making you aware of the process and the form, as well as, you know, the content and the topic. But you seem to be at pains to shift the focus towards the content. I mean, I went up to saw this exhibition this afternoon with a friend, and at the end of it, he said, well, where was Jeremy Deller's work?
Well, that's a very good question. I can answer that very quickly. I didn't want to be in the work is making the show, making the comparisons. Maybe my work would be the jukebox. I mean, if you want to think of something that I've created from this for the show. But I'm not really interested in putting myself in the work necessarily. And I'll tell you, well, one reason is I find a lot of contemporary artists is really about them as people rather than the work they make. No names, but you know, it's about personality, and it's about the strength of the personality of the artist is what's important. What they make is immaterial. It's not interesting. It's the personality and the sort of celebrity around that person. I'm not into that so much. I mean, I do a bit of that kind of thing, but I try not to sort of make it the only thing that makes the work interesting. I mean, this, I suppose it's the legacy of Andy Warhol, really, is good and bad for me. I mean, he's one of my favourite artists, but a lot of artists have taken like the 10%, the celebrity aspect, and used that as their way of presenting themselves to the public. But actually, someone like Warhol was much more interesting, much more revolutionary as an artist than we might think, because we kind of debased it just down to money and personality and so on. But I'm everywhere in that show. I'm not going to insert my work presumptuously into a big exhibition about something else. That's not something I'm that interested in, to be honest.
Can I? Sorry. I just very, very quickly. You know, contradiction was very important for Marx. He wasn't just a straightforward, you know, for progress. He saw that, and then the sort of real downside, and you know, the decay and violence and the sort of loss of communities. So there's contradiction. I'm just thinking it might be quite interesting to think about you in that exhibition in terms of you're sort of not there, but you are there. So
Well, if you curate a show, you're there.
Absolutely.
But I'm not going to throw in a sort of artworks about. Also, I did a film for the show as well, which probably you could more or less class as an artwork, if you want. But I'm not going to have a picture of me wearing a miner's uniform, kind of running around or whatever. It's not going to happen.
But you always delegate, whether it's through the curatorial act of assembling,
well, you have to.
Things and artworks, or whether it's through the social situations.
Well, you have to. If you're working with lots of people, you can't do everything. Mm. It's like a film director doesn't do the lighting or the makeup, or whatever. You're there directing something. That's how it works sometimes. Not all the time, but some of the time.
Going back to when I first knew your work, say to something like Acid Brass. I think what surprised me was, on the surface it seemed to be quite postmodern in its eclecticism and its surprising cross-referencing of things that don't normally sit together. But I think what made it quite different from postmodernism as we come to know it in the 80s was that you were always interested in cause and effect, I think, in one thing becoming something else. And that, I think, made it very different from very quotational and parodic.
But that was about change as well, and as much as that image of Adrian Street with his father is about from industrial to post-industrial, that is about an industrial form of music, the brass band. It's a relationship to acid house music, which is a purely digital music. And if there is a relationship between the two, and the journey that Britain takes from one to the other.
And how important was did you do cultural studies at undergraduate level? I kind of think of your ethos as being very informed by cultural studies, which is
I did a little bit
in contrast to, say, art history and the way that it would create a cultural hierarchy between.
I did a little bit when I did an MA. When I did an MA at Sussex, I wrote about my MA report was about teddy boys, so I read Richard Hoggart. Just died, actually, didn't he? So, for use of literacy, about American culture and what he thought was going to be the end of the world, basically, with American culture coming in and destroying any vernacular culture. So I read a little bit around that.
And Dawn, I don't want to make stretch too much for a point, but would you see this as kind of having roots in modernist collagist practice?
Jeremy's work?
Wow. Well,
I decided I couldn't see. It's very sui generis. It's not, it seems to me.
I was just thinking of a kind of modernist form there.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I'm not sure I would call it a modernist form, actually. There I try to hold on to something that was already anti-modernist at the very beginning, with the photomontages, actually.
Okay. Too big a point.
This must be the last question. Surely.
Yes. Yeah. Third row back.
We'll be in the bar afterwards, so you can come and harangue me there if you want for about 45 minutes.
I just wanted to ask a question about Brian Ferry.
He's a singer. He is from the northeast.
Is there any other work that you've made where...
Where are you, anyway?
I'm here.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Have you made any other work where people have objected to it? I just wanted you to talk a bit more about the moral ambiguity, about making a piece of work when the person doesn't want to be in it. I make films and I spend an awful lot of my time securing permissions so I can show my work legally in cinemas and broadcast, and that's an enormous part of what I do, but I'm quite enticed and interested in what I do.
With film it's different, isn't it?
Yeah.
You've got to sign the release form and so on. You don't need a release form to have someone's family tree in an exhibition. Legally we're fine. It was just a sort of slightly ethical thing, but I was kind of annoyed they didn't want it to be seen, basically. And but no, on the whole, you'd never do it. It's funny. The only person I've probably pissed off is Brian Ferry, of all the people I've worked with, or maybe pissed him off. But no, on the whole, if you can't look someone in the eye after you've done a project with them or something with them, then you've probably failed in your sort of attempts to do something new or do something interesting, I think. But obviously, some people you want to piss off. You go out of your way to annoy, but they're not necessarily in the work.
Maybe one or two more questions, since I've talked too much. Yes, the lady in the cardigan. Describe
Hi. I've spent quite a lot of time in industrial China, and reading the accounts of what it's like working in factories in China back in the UK and also in Chinese newspapers, it's quite different from what I witnessed firsthand. And I was wondering how you'd find creating this exhibition without that kind of free press or freer press that was in the UK at the time.
Sorry, just how, if it had been more difficult to make the show?
Yeah, I see you rely quite heavily on print and media and maybe TV clips as well. And if what's portrayed is very influenced by the government through censorship, how different do you think creating your exhibition would be?
Well, it would have been more difficult, obviously. It's funny because I'm sure conditions in Chinese coal mines are probably more or less like they would have been in like 1880 in Britain. And a lot of factories as well, without a doubt, and other countries. But, you know, child labour and so on is still not quite solved as an issue, I'm sure, in a lot of countries. But the Industrial Revolution hasn't finished, has it? It's still going on around the world. It's been exported, basically, as an idea or farmed out, which is something I'm also interested in. But it still exists. That's not answers your question, but I think it would have been obviously more difficult if there's no accounts of anything.
Because you've got that kind of comparison between what the government's portraying.
Well, they weren't trying to censor. I don't think people were trying to censor accounts because they were so amazed by it. No one really knew what was going on. I think a lot of the time people didn't know what was going on inside factories, and that's why the government set up committees to travel around and talk to people, which is where you get all the accounts from, but actually government sponsored a lot of them.
So I think it's really interesting that you're using kind of those songs that don't have the publisher listed at the bottom.
That's that's a sort of unofficial culture. But a lot of the strongest descriptions of factories are actually through government reports, where they would go around and talk to children and ask them what their lives are like, and they didn't hold back because there's these brutal accounts of what happens to them.
That's really interesting. Thanks.
Okay, final question from someone that hasn't spoken yet. Okay, well done.
So I've tricked you. There's two questions, actually. I'll make them quick, though. The way that the show came to Nottingham Castle, did it come there because it was felt it was an appropriate venue, because Nottingham is a fairly classic case of an industrial city moving into the post-industrial city? Was that deliberate, or did it just end up there?
We were looking for towns where it had some sort of resonance. These shows don't go to London as a rule, which is interesting. I quite like the idea of that. So we were looking for towns where people either been lent material or we thought it would have some sort of interest. We wanted to go to Wales, but because of this First World War anniversary this year, most galleries in Britain are full up with sort of First World War events or exhibitions and so on. So unfortunately couldn't go to South Wales because obviously there's about a third of the material seems to come from Wales or is about Wales. But yes, I mean, it's going to Newcastle. Oh, no, it's going to Warwick, I think, and then Newcastle, which is where the John Martin was lent from. So that, so we're taking John Martin to Newcastle, and this is it's great for it to end up there.
Right. Just to end with, make a connection with what my friend in front of me is talking about, marks and things. This exhibition, whether you like it or not, you are in that exhibition as a curator, and you are all over the place.
Yeah.
What isn't clear, and what's very frustrating for viewers, is what your position is, what your personal view is on these changes which you document.
Yeah.
The change from the great industrial heaviness of the past to this kind of air-based society where we make things and well, we don't actually make anything. We buy things, but we don't actually make anything.
Yeah.
What's your position? Is this good, bad, or are you just presenting it and saying, look, here we are, isn't this interesting?
I don't know what my position is, to be honest. I'm interested in it as a phenomenon, and also probably interested in the phenomenon that this country is the first country to go through these changes. That's another thing that interests me, to go through the whole process. I'm still trying to make my mind up and work it out, and in a way, when you do exhibitions, you try and make things more clear to yourself. They're pieces of ongoing research into how you feel about things. You see, I'm more fascinated by it than having like clear views about this was a bad thing, that was a good thing. Because obviously, the Industrial Revolution liberated people as well as enslaving them, or some people. So it really depends on the individual. So I can't really give you whether I'm for or against it.
Thank you.
If that's the right way. That's a good end, isn't it? Surely. Did you want to say something? No. Okay.
Okay, good point to stop.
I need a drink after that. Surely.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thanks.
Thank you, Dawn. Thank you to all of you. Thank you to Nottingham Castle, and thank you to Hayward Touring. The bar's still open. I think he'll be around, and so the conversation can continue there. Thank you.
This is a really nice catalog, isn't it?
I'm sorry about mobile phone.
You're sorry about what?
Mobile phone going.
You only want to go
Take it. I'm so,